Chapter 2. The opening vignette talks about Queen Isabella and Christopher Columbus were born the same year. And the two of them, of course, eventually met. Queen Isabella was the daughter of a king of Castile. And she was not scheduled to be queen at first because she had an older brother, but the older brother died without children, so she wound up getting the throne. She would not marry the person her older brother picked out for her to marry, so she wound up marrying instead King Ferdinand, and that meant that Spain was now going to be united because King Ferdinand ruled about the fourth of Spain, and she ruled about 2/3 of Spain. Now I know that's not all, because the Moors, the Muslims, had the other part of Spain. But once they got together, they formed the United Nation of Spain. But her kingdom was bigger than his. That meant that if she wanted to, she could rule the roost because she was more powerful than he. And if she made a decision to do something with her realm, there was nothing you could say against it. Keep that in mind because that's very important, has a very important bearing on what happened. All right, backing up a little bit, and again, because your book does. When your book starts with an opening vignette that talks about something that's going to happen in the middle of the chapter. Fine and dandy. Backing up a little bit, in the year 1000, the Vikings crossed the Atlantic. Now, the Vikings first went to Iceland. Then some of them, I think, got blown by a storm and wound up in Greenland. And then some of them wound up from Greenland to Nova Scotia. The maps here will show where these places are. So and of course some of them had to flee because they'd committed some kind of crime. Eric the Red had committed some kind of a crime and was driven out of Norway, so he went to Iceland. And then went to Iceland and committed something else that people there didn't like, so he went west to Greenland. His son went on to Nova Scotia, Leif Erikson by name. Eric the Red was a convinced pagan, remained a believer in Thor and Odin and Loki, Freyja, and all those gods all of his life. But Leif Erikson became a Christian, as did a lot of Vikings at that time. Anyway, the Viking colony went to Nova Scotia. They encountered the Indians, but in the year 1000, the Indians were much more powerful than they became 500 years later. The Vikings, even though they had iron swords and iron helmets and iron breastplates, they were no match for the Indians because the Indians greatly outnumbered them. Now, 500 years later, of course, you're going to have a different scenario. The Indians were greatly decreased in number and decreased in size, and the Europeans had developed gunpowder, among other things, gunpowder and steel, and it had much, much bigger ships. But anyway, the Vikings built a town that has eventually been found. It's all grown over now with underbrush and weeds. The Pope, and this is something the book doesn't mention, the Pope sent a bishop to the land of Newfoundland to keep the Vikings, you might say, Christianized. But after 10 years, the Vikings were forced to leave, owing mostly to the American Indians. The rest of Europe was unaware of it. In fact, Europeans did not know for many years that they believed the Viking sagas or not. Eventually, though, the Viking sagas about going to a land on the other side of Greenland proved to be true. All right. Now, jumping ahead about 300 more years, well, all right, jumping back. Greenland was not called Greenland because they wanted to attract settlers, and they gave it a false name. The fact is, Greenland was truly a green land, and we know that the Vikings living there were farming in Greenland the same way they had farmed in Scandinavia. That has been impossible for the last 1,000 years or so. But it is believed that during the High Middle Ages, and that was what the year 1000 was, the northern hemisphere, at least, and probably the whole globe, was as hot as a firecracker. We have grapes that they describe in Newfoundland growing in the year 1000 that today will not grow any farther north than the state of New Jersey. Either the grapes have changed or the climate has changed. But the fact that the Vikings were able to farm using the same, they carried with them their horses, their cattle, their sheep and donkeys and whatever to Greenland. They were able to farm in Greenland for 100 years or 200, the same way they farmed back in the old world. And you might ask, wasn't the rest of Europe aware of it? They did not have an internet, they did not have telephones, they did not have newspapers as such. No, the rest of the world was not aware of it. Then came the Ice Age. In the early 1300s, the Vikings would have survived if they had learned to get along with the Eskimos. They didn't. The Eskimos never had it better. The Eskimos knew how to handle that kind of cold. The Vikings didn't. Problem was the Vikings living there in Greenland all died. Today we have gone in there and dug up some of their graves and found that their graves included people that they could not afford to lose, young women of childbearing age. But also when the Vikings finally came back in the year 1500, some 200 years later after Columbus, they found the last of the Vikings had died in their beds with nobody to bury them. Just a few. The rest of them had been buried, but the last of them had died in their beds. Again, the Ice Age, their farm animals all died. Their crops could not grow at all. Snow covered the whole place, and the snow did not melt in the summertime. This was the Ice Age. It occurred in the 1300s. Now, in the meantime, in Europe, the Ice Age was felt. A plague struck the Europeans, which we call the Black Death. The Black Death carried away a third of Europe's population. Now, when the Black Death hit, it wiped out whole villages. I mean, it really created a really, really bad stir. And Europeans were even afraid to bury their dead. A lot of times they didn't leave their dead alone, and they were afraid to treat their sick neighbors or sick family members. And it hit upper classes and lower classes alike. There were two types of people, though, that it didn't hit. The old maids. All right, let me ask you, what do old maids tend to have around their dwelling places? Anybody know in one word, what do old maids tend to have?
Can I where? Where? You said around what place?
Okay, in one word, folks. Anybody know felines, otherwise known as cats? All right, what good did the cats do them? Here's what it did. The Black Death was carried by Genghis Khan and his army when they traveled from Mongolia to Turkey and into the Mediterranean area. Genghis Khan traveled into the Muslim world there around Baghdad and what is today Iran and Iraq, and rats followed him. The rats carried the fleas carried the germ that caused the Black Death. There was a virus. Today we know that. This virus was really particular, though, about who it infected. The virus would only infect the black rat and humans. Rats and humans have a lot in common. That's why they use this for experiments. This flea was so particular that it would not even infect the brown rat that came later and drove the black rat off. But anyway, now, what did cats do for the old maids? All right, here's what. This is something I just learned less than a year ago. A pope, Pope Gregory VII, had decreed that cats were of the devil and that cats should be destroyed. Europeans began to systematically destroy their cats, all but the old maids who weren't going to part with their cats, pope or no pope. And another group of people, the Jews, who were not under the influence of the Pope anyway. As a result, the Jews did not tend to die like the rest of Europeans, and neither did the old maids, and nobody knew why.
Because they ate the
The
rats.
Jews and old maids were both hated. The old maids were called witches and oftentimes were burned at the stake for witchcraft. And to be being part of the Jews were called witches, yes, that's right, and so were the old maids. Yeah, the Jews were accused of witchcraft. And they had these pogroms. The word pogrom means destroy the Jews. Now, persons who hate Jews are anti-Semite, and anti-Semitism reached a head during World War II. For a while it seemed to die off, but it seems making a comeback, folks. Anti-Semitism is a constant problem that the world has had, particularly the Western world. I mean, it's there. But it's a little bit off the topic now. But what is on the topic is the Black Death. With a third of Europe's population gone, the 2/3 were left became more bold, less fearful of dying, and more bold. And something I want to mention about the Black Death, these boys would get together, and elementary school students do, and sing a song, ring around the roses, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. They believed that filling their pockets with flowers might keep the plague off of them. I don't know if it would, but they thought that. What would really have helped them was to keep some cats around. But anyway, yeah.
So why did the cats help the old man?
The cats destroyed the rats that carried the plague. Oh, maybe I didn't make that clear. Thanks for asking. I thought that was obvious. No, the cats kept the rats away. Not only do cats keep rats away, but they keep other rodents. They keep away squirrels, mice, and even small snakes. Yeah, good animals for the farmer. They're a really good investment. But again, Europe had a shortage of them in the 1300s. No, they were not all killed. The few that survived managed to have more cats. But anyway, the cats kept the rats away that carried the plague. Plague lice. Now, so the Europeans got bolder. The Portuguese began to encourage their people to sail south. Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator encouraged his sailors to try to go around Africa. Now, everyone who was educated in Portugal knew the earth was round. If you've heard that Columbus was the only person of his day who believed the earth was round, this was wrong. In Portugal, they had no doubt that the earth was round. But for the one problem the Portuguese had was, where did the continent of Africa end? Did Africa go so far south that they'd never get around it? Now, if they had read their history books, they should have known that a Persian king had sent a ship across the Mediterranean all the way around Africa and back to Persia more than 1,200 years before. But they didn't know this. This has been lost to European history books. Today we know it, but the Persians had already gone around Africa at least once. But anyway, Henry the Navigator was the fourth son of the King of Portugal. He never got to be king because, again, he was the fourth son. When his father died, his older brother inherited the throne, but he remained in good terms with his brother the whole time. He had the title of prince. Bartholomew Diaz finally reached the tip of Africa, but instead of going on, he turned around and went back towards Portugal. Hey, Africa comes to an end. I saw the end. He called it the Cape of Good Hope, and it's still called the Cape of Good Hope today. So a few years later, I mean, with all respect to Diaz, he didn't have enough food and water and enough planning to go all the way to India. But a few years later, another man who had planned it much more carefully went all the way around, Vasco da Gama. Went all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and went up to India, offloaded his goods and unloaded some Indian goods, spices mostly, and nuts and whatever stuff would survive the trip back. Then he went back around Africa and back up to Portugal and convinced the world that, hey, this can be done. Now, for the people of India, I mean, I'm jumping ahead of the story a little bit. This was a bit of bad news, but they didn't know it. These dirty, ragged European sailors who came there with scurvy and a bunch of ragged, dirty ships were going to wind up taking over India. Not the Portuguese, they didn't have the resource, but another European country, namely Great Britain, was eventually going to conquer India. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. I hope all of you already know two things about American history. Number one, hope you all know that we fought a war against our mother country, Great Britain, at one time. And I hope you all know that we fought a big war among ourselves called the Civil War. I'll mention these wars from time to time, but essentially though, this was to eventually lead to India being conquered by Great Britain, but nobody knew that at the time. Portugal was just too small, though, too small to hold much of Africa, and too small to conquer and hold India. But nevertheless, the Portuguese, and again, if you look on the map, you can see the logic. Portugal is the last country on the far end of Europe, the western end of Europe. So it's only logical that they'd be the first ones to go around Africa. They might have discovered America, except for what they didn't. Now, here's the story of the next man. I want to talk about Columbus. Your book says he was a poor man, grew up in poverty. Much of his boyhood, though, is unknown. He had two brothers, Bartholomew and Diaz, I believe. But again, much of the story of his youth is unknown. He does make reference that he once went to Iceland. He had a few illegitimate children. One of his illegitimate sons wrote most of what we know about him, wrote a biography about him, which we still have a copy of. But when he married, people went, why didn't he marry this woman he had the reason was, I think, was that she was not rich enough for him. All right, he married the adopted daughter of Prince Henry. Now this woman was the daughter of a noble couple. She was orphaned. The Black Death had carried away her father and mother. So Prince Henry took her in. So basically what this means is that Columbus married into royalty. Now folks, there's something about this story that doesn't add up. Christopher Columbus, number one, he practically married into royalty. And number two, he could associate with the King of Portugal. He went and the King and Queen of Spain. An ordinary ship captain would not do that. He'd be run out of court. There are persons who say that Columbus was a man of high birth and a man of nobility. Be that as it may, there are also persons who say that Henry the Navigator is known to have had a map of the world that included North and South America and even included Antarctica. The Turks had a map that included North and South America that the prince had gotten a hold of, and that the prince gave Columbus one of these maps. And that Columbus knew all along where he was going. Now, if I'm confusing you, I'm confused myself. So, now I don't know what I believe about Columbus. There are stories. I mean, your book says he was a very deeply religious man. There are persons who say he was of Jewish background, but he was a converted Jew, converted to Christianity. Now, again, if you know anything at all about the history of Portugal and Spain at this time, they had trouble with the Muslims who almost took them over. They fought them against the Muslims for 700 years and finally drove them out. The year they drove them out was 1492. That was when the King and Queen of Spain could consider helping Columbus. In the meantime, though, they tried to conquer Portugal. They could not. The mountains between Spain and Portugal were too steep, and Queen Isabella sent an army in to conquer Portugal. The Portuguese, number one, they were separated by mountain. Number two, they were separated by a language barrier. The Portuguese language is a lot like Spanish, but if you're a Spanish person, unless you have had training, you won't understand Portuguese. And if you're Portuguese, unless you've had training, you won't understand Spanish. The language is a little bit different. Anyway, if you've learned Spanish, you can learn Portuguese fairly easily. The languages are much alike and yet enough different that you can't understand the other one without training. But anyway, the Spanish had fought a lot of wars. Well, folk, I can understand why that Queen Isabella would want to, and her husband Ferdinand would want to drive out the Muslim. The Muslims were in a habit of making raids and stealing from, and then swooping on a village, stealing from it and disappearing. Then they'd swoop, make another raid and disappear. I can understand why that the Queen would want to drive them out, but here's where Spain made its biggest mistake. they assumed that because they couldn't get along with the Muslims, whom they called Moors, they couldn't get along with the Moors, they had to drive out the Jews and Protestants also. Huge mistake. The Jews were among their best and brightest citizens, and so were the Protestants, and Spain wound up impoverished. And a lot of the blame goes to the king and queen who were overzealous. But anyway, Queen Isabella at first feigned like she was interested in helping Columbus. Then she finally sent Columbus on his way and told Columbus, I can't help you. Columbus then said, I'll go to the King of France. So he mounted a horse. But Queen Isabella had a Jew who was her finance minister. Now, this Jew was a converted Jew, converted to Christian. Again, all Jews either had to convert or get out or be killed. One or the other. They had three choices: get out, convert, or be killed. This Jew, he might have been a sincerely Christian, I don't know. But her finance minister was a very wealthy man. He said, Your Majesty, I'll finance the trip out of my own pocket so that nothing will come out of your royal treasury. Bring Columbus back, and I'll pay for outfitting 3 of your old ships. Queen Isabella sent a man on a fast horse to overtake Columbus. The man found Columbus. Don't ask me how, but he found Columbus and said, Turn back. Your Majesty wants to talk to you again. Queen Isabella outfitted Columbus with 3 ships, old and decrepit. But nevertheless, Columbus got to work at fixing them up with money that came from this Jewish advisor to the Queen, as her finance minister. He got to outfitting them. He started sailing west in 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Hopefully you all heard some of this in elementary school. Columbus wound up landing on an island. Now, according to what he believed, the standard view is he believed he had landed in the East Indies. He knew the East Indies were a bunch of islands between Asia and Australia, as the East Indies Islands. But he landed in the West Indies. He called the people he met Indians. Now, to outfit Columbus's crew, Queen Isabella had told a bunch of jailbirds, I'll release you from prison if you'll become part of Columbus's crew. What this means is that Columbus did not carry along the best Europe had to offer, but he carried along a bunch of boys and a bunch of jailbirds, a bunch of the worst people Europe had to offer. Well, one day he put an 11-year-old boy at the helm of a big ship, the Santa Maria. Don't ask me why. This 11-year-old boy crashed into some rocks. Maybe a grown man couldn't have done better. But he came to a point where 2 oceans come together near the island of Hispaniola. Crashed the Santa Maria to pieces. That meant Columbus could not take all this crew back. Columbus did take 7 Indians back with him, along with gold. I mean, they found gold. And he left behind in a fort the crewmen who he could not take back and said, I'll come back for you later. So Columbus went back and showed Queen Isabella the gold and the men he'd taken. The Indians he'd taken could not understand what they were doing or their language, but nevertheless they were baptized in Christianity, whether they knew what that meant or not. They never went back. But instead Columbus wound up leading a fleet of 17 ships. I mean, this time, folk, unlike 500 years with Vikings, this time kings were involved. And this meant armies and navies were involved. Columbus got the title of nobility and 17 ships and went back to the island of Hispaniola, where he left a fort, and here's the part of the story. He found all the men left behind were dead, murdered. We do not know why. There was a language barrier. Columbus could not understand the natives, and they couldn't understand him. It's believed that these men might have provoked their deaths by going and getting hungry, going and stealing from the Native Americans. That is possible, but whatever. The white Europeans said, these people are evil. We didn't realize that they're evil, and that began what amounted to 400 years of warfare between European and Native American, that the Native American was destined to lose. I say destined. Now, it appeared that the Native Americans drew the first blood. And while we used to celebrate Columbus Day, the celebration of Columbus Day has fallen into disrepute. Columbus Day is, by the way, is October 12th. Because Columbus now goes down in history as a mass murderer. I want to say this, folks, Columbus could not help the diseases that spread among the Indians. He did not deliberately use germ warfare to kill a bunch of the population. What was, well, okay, one of the diseases was smallpox, which the Indians had no resistance to whatever. Persons who live around cattle have a resistance to smallpox because cattle, if you're around cattle, you get cowpox. And that is a mild form of smallpox that immunizes you against smallpox. Africans had cattle, the Indians, people of India had cattle, the Japanese had cattle, the Chinese had cattle, but smallpox still made a big dent in their population, but nothing like the young Indians. The Indians had no resistance to it, whatever. They died as soon as it touched them. Typhoid fever, same thing. Typhoid fever was a big problem, and it killed my grandma in 1926. We still didn't have a cure for it. Today, of course, all of you are probably immunized against typhoid fever. They didn't have an immunization back then. And then, of course, the American Indians had no resistance to that disease either. So really, Columbus was not to blame. Now, here's this point I want to make, folks. You had two groups of people, one on one side of the Atlantic and one on the other, separated by 4,000 miles of ocean, neither one aware the other existed. It was inevitable that one day, one group was going to discover the other. They had a very unequal culture. And folk, what happened was terrible to say the least, but I am not sure that anything that did happen could have been done differently. You can tell me if you want to, well, the white man should have stayed put. If you had lived in Columbus Day, if you had not come over, your cousins would have, and you could not have stopped them. If you had not come over yourself, your brother would have, and you could have done nothing to stop them. If the Spanish had not done it, the English would have, and eventually the English did. If the Spanish or English wouldn't have, the French would have, and eventually the French did. The Dutch eventually came over. A clash between the two different cultures, there was no way you could have avoided it. I'm going to elaborate on that in the minutes ahead. Now again, if you disagree with what I'm saying, that's fine. The standard view is the dirty European was all at fault. Everything that was wrong because of the Europeans destroyed their way of life. I'm not sure that what their way of life didn't need to be destroyed. If you believe that the Europeans should have stayed home, you are asking of humanity something that humanity simply cannot deliver. You are living in an unreal world. In a world of reality, people are curious. In a world of reality, some people are bold and adventuresome. And in a world of reality, if there's wealth to be grabbed, people are going to grab it. If you think it should be otherwise, maybe it should, but in the real world, it isn't. What happened was basically, for all practical purposes, inevitable. Eventually, one side was to discover the other. If the Indians had come across first and discovered Europe, Europeans would have followed them back home, and the result would have been the same. I've spent years thinking about this, and again, you don't have to agree with me. This is the way I see it, folk. What happened was inevitable. Well, anyway, other nations got involved. The French sent an expedition to explore Canada, but that expedition amounted to nothing at first. Now later, France established colonies. England sent John Cabot 5 years after when Cabot came and found Newfoundland, not knowing the Vikings had been there 500 years before. And when John Cabot found Newfoundland, his boat was almost stopped by a bunch of codfish. Maybe they said